So my talk is going to be divided into two, sort of maybe 2/3 and 1/3. The first 2/3, I'm going to take you on my personal journey through a particular area of research. Talking about these features you can see on this first slide here. These are gullies on Mars, which I've been actually studying since my PhD, and I've carried on and learned more, and as I'll show you, it's been a bit of a journey of me and a questioning and a re-questioning. It's a very classic scientific investigation, so I'm gonna take you through that journey, and it's kind of symbolic or representative of how planetary research often goes. A sort of an initial expectation, and then that gets broken, and then we come up with new theories. So I think it's kind of neat. So let's get going. I'm first going to start with just a little bit of a brief history of Mars, just so that we're all on the same page and you know what I'm going to be, well, you know the context in which I'm talking. So Mars is a planet where we can access its ancient history. So we know quite a lot about early history. So when I say early history, I'm talking 3 to 4 billion years ago. I'm not talking a few million years or a few tens of million years or even hundreds of million years. This is a few billion years ago. And we know that a few billion years ago on Mars, 4 to 3.5 billion years ago, there was a lot of water at its surface. I'm not going to talk about that today. And we also know there was a lot of other geological processes going on at the same time. So we had a lot of volcanic activity, we had an active magnetic field and dynamo, which meant a thicker atmospheric atmosphere. And a lot of things that we might consider normal on Earth, such as chemical alteration of minerals, so forming clays and such like. So that all happened 3.5 billion years ago. And since that time, the evidence for surface liquid water has been gradually diminishing, and we end up on the right-hand part of this sort of plot, where you can see, if you look at the panel D, the evidence for water is these small blobs. So very little evidence for liquid water. So we go from a planet that was warm and wet to one that's cold and dry, and through this sort of gradual decrease in aqueous activity at the surface, linked to the loss of Mars's atmosphere and the gradual cooling in general of the planet itself. So where does that leave us now? So Mars today, we have a lot of orbiters around Mars today. We have landers on the surface, so we actually know the current environmental conditions today very well. We know we have a very good idea of the surface temperatures. We know that they vary. The minimum surface temperature is that of the condensation point of carbon dioxide, so around a minus 150 Celsius. And on a warm day, at the equator, in the summer, you can get up to 20 or 30 degrees Celsius. And that is the sort of average surface temperatures. Obviously, given a certain latitude and time of year, these can be very variable. And because Mars's atmosphere is thin, so I say here 7 millibars, so you can compare that to Earth, which is around 800 to 1,000 millibars on a normal day. It's a very thin atmosphere, and so what that means is you end up with very high diurnal variations in surface temperature as well. Now, as I said, Mars is dry. It's very, very dry because we measure the atmospheric humidity in using a unit called precipitable micrometers. So what that means is if we take the whole column of the atmosphere and we took all the water that was in that column and condensed it into a layer, it would be micrometers thick. So that's the whole entire atmosphere into a few micrometers in thickness. And so the atmospheric humidity goes up to hundreds of precipitable micrometers, but not very much more than that. So Mars is very dry. What that means is because it's very dry and very cold, so the partial pressure of H2O is low. This means that we're usually below the triple point in the phase diagram for water. And so water undergoes condensation and sublimation. It doesn't go through its liquid phase. So we do have an active hydrocycle on Mars. Water does go from its ice state to its vapor state and back again with the seasons. We know this. But we don't go through that portion of melt in the middle. But there have been a lot of papers over the last decades which have claimed to find and have reported evidence for liquid water at the Martian surface, and I'm going to talk about one example of this. But what I want to say just before I get into that is there is a lot of ice on Mars. So even though we talk about the fact that water is not common at the surface of Mars, we're talking about liquid water. So actually there's a lot of ice at the surface of Mars. And that's really important to bear in mind because obviously you don't have this problem of availability. If you want to make liquid water and you have the right environmental conditions, you can, because there is water that can be transformed into liquid. So I should mention as well here, when I say lots of ice, I should put that into context because there are 2 polar caps on Mars and they are made of water ice. So that's it. That'll be important for later on. So this is the subject I'm going to talk about. These are gullies on Mars, and this is the initial discovery paper that was published in Science in the year 2000, starting to become an old paper now. The paper was such big news that it actually featured on the front cover when we actually had printed versions of journals. So this is the front cover of Science with a gully on Mars. And the title of this paper, and I'm going to enlarge it just in case you can't see it, you have a small screen, was Evidence for Recent Groundwater Seepage and Surface Runoff on Mars. And this was inspired by the discovery of these gullies, which are tributary networks of channels that start off in a source alcove. They go transport through the channels onto a fan or debris apron at the bottom, which is very typical, classic sediment transport system that we might find in a gully on Earth as well. And you can see on the first page of this paper, they present a map to show that there's not just one of these things, there's several. And I've made that a bit bigger for you so you can see it. And I've made the points colors so you can see them. And so this was the initial sort of, I don't know, 20 or 30 sites that were discovered by the Mars Orbital Camera back in 2000. And so this was huge news. We have these features that have these channels. On Earth, you can't get these without liquid water. So, and you can see that the authors in this, even in this first paper, realized that this was a big issue for our understanding of the present day atmosphere, because they cite groundwater as being the source. They know that you can't get liquid water at the present day surface of Mars, so they found the other solution, which is to look under the ground for that water. This is just to give you an idea of where we are now. So this was published in 2015, and I would say this is pretty much how we understand the distribution of gullies to be today. So we're looking at 5,000-ish sites with gullies. It could be a few more, it could be a few less. This is not going to change very much. This is one of the most complete data sets we have. At 6 meters per pixel, this mapping was done pretty much globally with images from the context camera on Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter. And I say 5,000 points. 5,000 points is 5,000 sites, and each one of those sites actually has a series of gullies, maybe 10, maybe 1, maybe 3, maybe 20, maybe 50. And so actually this means tens of thousands of gullies over the surface of Mars. So We're not just talking about, you know, a few tens of sites, special sites. We're talking about an awful lot, and it gets really hard to try to evoke groundwater for such a wide range of terrains. Another thing that will pop out straight away to you here as well is that there's a lack of gullies in the equatorial region. When I say lack of gullies, actually we have some evidence for gullies in the equatorial region, but they're not kilometer scale. They're actually a lot smaller than we can detect with this 6 meter per pixel imager. So this is why they aren't included on this map. There are a few, but let's say they're not well developed. So the well developed gullies aren't found at the equator. You'll also notice the points on this map have different colors. This refers to the orientation. And I'll come back to that in a second. This is just to show you the wide variety of shapes and forms that we find for gullies on Mars. They're found on steep slopes. This is universal. If you don't have a steep slope, you won't have gullies, but not all steep slopes have gullies. That's another issue, but they have a wide variety of shapes and forms, but they are found on a wide variety of different substrates. So impact crater walls, different types of rocky impact crater walls, debris-covered crater walls made out of sedimentary rocks, crater walls made out of igneous rocks, slopes of dunes. So the third one, this panel here is actually gullies formed on the side of a dune, sand-covered crater walls. So all sorts of places. And this is another series of examples here. You can see that they have single channels, multiple channels, inset channels, multiple fans, sometimes not. So for example, this example on the left here is only a very small one, a very small fan here. You can't maybe even see the fan itself. They go from hundreds of meters in size to the biggest gully is around 3 kilometers in length, approximately. But I mean, essentially the scale of the gully scales with the hill slope it has available. So the length of the gully is not really to do with, necessarily to do with the development stage. So this was the start of the story, this very strong resemblance of gullies on Mars to gullies on Earth. And I'm showing you obviously some very nice examples from Earth that look very much like the ones we have on Mars. You can see the similarity in scale. As I said before, that's maybe not so important because the scale depends on the scale of the hill slope, but that is also the case on Earth. You have the tributary areas at the top with the channels leading into, with the tributary channels leading into a main channel, same thing on Mars. And then you have a deposit apron or fan where there's discontinuous channels and there's debris. And not only in their visual appearance, but if you start to look at the morphometry, so if you measure in elevation data the sort of organization and structure of these features, they actually resemble each other an awful lot, and that's a whole, I could talk for another 20 minutes about that specific aspect, but I won't dwell on it here, just trust me. So there's a huge resemblance between the two. And another thing you want to notice from this particular slide as well is on Mars, there's something we don't have on Earth, which are these things called impact craters. We don't have small ones like this on Earth. And that's important because what that's telling us about the Martian gullies is that they're recent. So they didn't form the active fan portions often here. So for example, here don't have any craters on at all. Sometimes the old parts of the fans have impact craters on, and that has allowed us to give a maximum age of around 5 million years, but that's quite generous, possibly. The more likely answer is probably more around 1 or 2 million as the maximum age for these features, and they've been active many, many times. As you see here, this particular example, there's an active part of the fan and then a sort of dormant part of the fan which is older. And we can see this with different in selected places where there's difference in cratering density. So these are really recent features, and they really resemble gullies on Earth formed by either flowing liquid water or what we call debris flows, which are liquid and sediment mixed together. And if we have a look at the present day conditions on Mars, as I said to you at the beginning, this is an issue because we don't have on Mars, if we look at the temperature pressure plot I've given here for the stability of water. So we have solid, so ice, water vapor, gas, and liquid water here. And on Earth, we straddle this triple point. So the point at which water can be both liquid, solid, and a gas. On Mars, however, we're more likely in this part of the diagram. It is possible to come up here, but more often than not, we're down here, where water is either solid or a gas and nothing else. And what we can do, because we do know about the phase diagram of water, and we know the present atmospheric conditions on Mars, you can run models of the atmospheric circulation, and you can work out how, when, and where liquid water could be stable given the optimal conditions. And this is what I'm showing on the right-hand part of this plot. These are simulations done by Richardson and Michener, and we're using a global circulation model in 2005. And what they're showing you essentially is the total liquid water potential, TLWP, days per year. So this is the number of days per year that you could have liquid water given present day atmospheric conditions. And what you can see is that this is actually favored at the equator and in the two large impact basins, Argyre and Hellas. And if we look at the distribution of gullies, it doesn't match with this. So we know that the present day conditions on Mars are not conducive to the formation of liquid water at the surface. So what are the solutions to this problem? Well, as I referred to in the original paper, the Malin and Edgett, who reported gullies, knew about this problem. And so their solution was to say that, well, we have these features formed by liquid water. The water can't be generated at the surface, so we're going to bring it up from underground. And there's a few problems with this, and I'm not going to go into it in huge amounts of detail. One, there's a lot of gullies on Mars. It seems problematic to bring up groundwater everywhere. Many, many gullies are sourced at isolated peaks, and the way that you bring up water, groundwater, within the structure of an impact crater doesn't seem to stick with the observations we make of gullies. So in general, this theory of an aquifer source for gullies was really quickly ruled out by the community in the first, let's say, 5-10 years after the first publication, for those kinds of reasons, structural reasons, and actually we just honestly don't know enough about the subsurface of Mars. I don't think we can rule it out totally, but I'm not going to talk about it further in this talk. So what's the other two options that we could have? Well, I'm going to talk you through the option that reigned supreme champion for maybe 15 years after the discovery of gullies, and that is that we think that the water originates from the atmosphere, from surface deposits, and melting, but under a past climate. So not under present day climate, under a past climate where liquid water could be generated more easily. And I'll explain a bit about the theory behind that. And then the third option is that we're all wrong and it's not liquid water at all. And I'll talk about that nearer at the end. So we're going back to this global gully distribution. As I pointed out to you, the different colors mean different orientations. And so if I plot that slightly differently, this is the ratios. I should have reversed the colors on this, I'm sorry. Where red is majority pole-facing gullies and blue is majority equator-facing gullies. And the really striking thing is, when you plot it like this, is that there's this line at about 40 degrees latitude, both north and south, where the gullies switch from being entirely pole-facing to a mix between equator facing and pole facing, but mostly equator facing. That, together with the latitudinal distribution, is a really strong indicator of a climatic factor being at play, and so surface temperatures being really important. And so this is what drove really that research into looking for a climatic factor to explain these water created landforms. One thing I should note as well that probably is, you probably thought, but why is there so few gullies in the northern hemisphere compared to the southern hemisphere? And actually, I haven't shown this on the slide, but there's actually many fewer steep slopes in the northern hemisphere than there are in the south, and you can pretty much explain that the difference in density based on that argument on its own. So how can we make Mars have a different climate in the past? Well, Mars's tilt, its axial tilt, varies actually very considerably compared to Earth's. So this is a plot of the tilt, so obliquity with time, where present day is here on the left-hand side, and then we go to 10 million years in the past on the right. And that's as far as we can predict the Mars's orbital parameters, or even just the solar system dynamics as a whole, due to the sort of chaotic nature of the system. So what I've done here is just put a bar to illustrate this very small obliquity variations that undergoes the Earth compared to Mars. And even within this very small obliquity variation that we get on Earth, we can have glacial and interglacial cycles driven by those differences in latitudinal receipt of insolation. So on Mars, we go from 15 degrees axial tilt to nearly 35 if you talk about 5 million years ago, which is what we're talking about for gullies, and up to 45 if you look back to maybe 10 million years ago. What does this mean? Well, if we go back to that modeling study done by Richardson and Michener, they actually used their global climate model to explore this parameter space. So this was the transient liquid water days. This is what I was talking about before. And if you have a look at 45 degrees obliquity, you can make pretty much the whole entirety of the northern hemisphere experience transient liquid water. If you then increase the atmospheric pressure as well, you can pretty much get water everywhere on the planet, and you can get nearly 200 days of liquid water potential. Just for information, Mars's year is twice as long as Earth's, so this is 200 days would be most of the year on Earth. It's about half, well, it's about less than half a year or a third of the year on Mars. So how does this work? So this is essentially what I'm talking about here. So this is the present day obliquity on the left-hand side, where we have two thick polar caps, we have a thin atmosphere. If you then tilt those polar caps towards the sun when the obliquity is high, you actually redistribute that ice. You get a much more active exchange between the pole and the mid-latitudes, much more frequent change of state, and more active hydrological cycle. Slightly thicker atmosphere. We think that the southern polar cap actually contains CO2 ice as well as H2O ice, meaning that the total atmospheric pressure can be increased as well as the vapor pressure of water. So those things together mean that a more active cycling and the thicker atmosphere means that we have much more potential to get liquid water. So what does this mean? Well, I'm going to take the case of Misha-Krasnowski back in 2008 published this very nice illustration. So across the x-axis, you essentially have the different obliquity, and these little cups here are impact craters. And this is where we find most gullies. And so what you're looking at is the equator facing slopes and the pole facing slopes. The pole-facing slopes on this side and the equator-facing slopes on this side. And so this is a schematic of what goes on in terms of the temperature distributions inside impact craters. And so at the high latitudes, everything's cold in winter and everything's warm in summer, whereas in the mid-latitudes you end up with warmer equator-facing slopes at the present day. Whereas if you go to high obliquity, what happens is that the pole-facing slopes are the coldest, but also the hottest in the summer. And this is the key point. So this is why we think it's this particular box here, which is what led to the theory that Martian gullies were formed by this climatic process. Because this is if you imagine this is that 40-degree line here, so this is where equator and pole-facing gullies occur nearer the pole, and then only pole-facing gullies because you have this hottest slope and then coldest slope on the mid-latitudes. So this is kind of what we thought about. This is the kind of model where every winter you get that pole-facing slope is really, really cold, and so the water vapor in the atmosphere condenses on the surface in this cold pole-facing slope. Then in summer it warms up really quickly, and so that pushes you into the liquid water part of the phase diagram. Then you get debris flows and can cause these gullies, that can create these gullies. Okay. So I said that there was this happened under past climates. However, in the last sort of 15 years or so, we have discovered that gullies are active at the present day. So this is just an image showing a couple of changes in gullies. So what you can see, for example, here, this yellow arrow, the yellow arrows point to where there's new deposits. So here you can see a new blue deposit here, a new white deposit here. You can see this one has actually got bigger, and this one has extended down a bit further. And well, that was all okay to start off with. So when we first discovered the first few changes, that were these bright deposits at the surface, and they were just sort of a bright veneer, and you know, and we could just say, oh, it's dry mass wasting deposits in gullies. They're steep. You know, it's normal that they fail, and there's bits of the slope that end up going downhill. That's, you know, that's expected. But then what we started noticing was there was more than just sort of surface albedo changes, that actually the more we looked, the more we found. And in around 20% of cases that we monitor, there's actually a substantial change, such as a new channel. For example, this is a very nice example of that. Back in 2009, there was nothing there. Then there's a new channel formed here. And in 2018, that channel has got even longer. At the top right is just a little animated GIF showing that these flows, or whatever, these movements actually include relatively large boulders. I mean, look at the scale bar here. This boulder that's moving down slope is maybe 3 meters in diameter. So you can see these changes actually involve relatively large amounts of materials, as well as being able to carve channels. I mean, we're not talking, you know, massive rock avalanches or anything like that, only hundreds of meter cubed worth of material, but if you accumulate that over several million years, then you can end up creating a gully very, very easily. This is one of my favorite ones. I have to put it sideways because it doesn't fit vertically. And so we're flashing between two different scenes here. What you should notice at the top is that basically the debris is emptying from this part of the system here. Then you can see it emptying from the top part and gathering in the bottom part. And you can see this nice lobe of material that appears at the bottom of the gully system. And this is maybe a meter, half a meter thick. So a substantial quantity of material being transported down these slopes through the gully systems. And as I said, if you, even considering the very low cadence, so these activities in gullies. These changes in gullies happen in some places every year, but in most places once every 5 to 10 years, and sometimes we only see one change, and that's all we've seen in 10 years. So the cadence is not very, very high. It's not every year, but it's sufficient to generate sufficient quantities of sediment transport in some of these events to certainly explain the formation of the gullies over the sorts of timescales that we know they've been in existence for. So what do we think is causing these present day changes? And here this is a site near the south pole of Mars at 68 degrees south. I've turned the figure upside down because I visualize it better when the slope goes from top to bottom down the page. So I've turned this figure from Yanrak upside down. So north is down, but downslope is also down. And what we see in these particular gullies is that they are active at a time of year. So here, this is solar longitude, which is the season on Mars. And here you can see the surface temperature in this dotted line here, which is in Kelvin here. So we go up to 275 approximately Kelvin in the spring. And then this is the late spring here, defrosting. And what you can see is the changes are happening in these gullies at a time of year when the surface temperature is, let's say, between 170 and 190 Kelvin. And actually when we have the spectral signature for CO2 ice on the surface. So how is this possible? Well, what we have on Mars is an annual defrosting cycle where the surface temperatures around the polar regions get so cold that CO2 from the atmosphere condenses directly onto the surface. We don't know if it's a snow or direct condensation, but I'm going to say condensation. And this happens as autumn goes on. This condensation goes towards the equator latitudes and goes to about 50 degrees, north and south, as a continuous line. And this actually, you can see this sort of polar cap. Sorry, you can see this polar cap actually from telescopes from Earth as well, and it grows and shrinks every year in both the north and the south. And it's continuous, as I said, to 50, but it's discontinuous to around latitudes of 30 degrees north and south. And this is important because this is where we find gullies in both hemispheres. Is this a coincidence? Possibly. So this is the timing. Again, what I plotted down here is solar longitude, so season. And then this is actually, this time this is latitude. And so what I'm plotting in blue is when you see CO2 ice, either continuous or discontinuous, on the surface as this blue blob. I apologize for the horrible colors, sorry. And in black, what you can see are the only observations that we have of when gullies are active. So sometimes we see a change in a gully, but the image before was taken 4 years earlier, so we don't know when it occurred. Sometimes we're lucky enough to have images a few months apart or weeks apart, and then we can say, well, the activity must have happened between these two times. So that's what these black bars are. This is the image before the change, and this is the image after the change, so we're able to say the interval when it occurred. And you can see that these changes occur when there's CO2 ice on the surface. But the interesting fact is that if we look at the difference between the CO2 ice temperature and other surfaces, other defrosted surfaces, that's what this is, that the gully activity seems to be when there's both these frosted and defrosted surfaces in close proximity. So what does that mean? Well, that means you have more potential for sublimation. And so it could be the carbon dioxide sublimating that could be driving these motions. But can CO2 actually do this work? Can CO2 move boulders? Can it carve channels? And this is actually something that we don't know and that we're actually doing work on at the moment. And so on the right, you can see an experiment in a Mars simulation chamber. This is a top-down view on a sloping sediment, and it's speeded up 64 times. So this is about an hour's worth of experiment that you're watching. And so yes, we show from these experiments that CO2 condensed into the regolith can trigger movements. So that's reassuring. But what we don't know is whether it can move boulders or fluidize movements onto low slopes. This is something we're working on now. So we can do lab work to look at this question. And the other thing that we're doing to look at this question as well is doing some numerical modeling, some actually 3D dynamic modeling here. And so we're using avalanche models that have been established on Earth and calibrating them to the observed deposits that we find on Mars. Over what we need is the topography to do this. So we need to generate high resolution topography, and we can do that from stereo images. And then we can run this kind of simulation, and we can work out what the kind of realistic, for example, here, these are the friction parameters that go in. Don't worry about the axes, but what you should look at is the different plot colored points. So essentially, we compared Martian gullies to rock avalanches on Earth, pyroclastic flows, snow avalanches, but then debris flows, and actually the red points, the Mars points, and you can see that the gully deposits we're seeing at the present day are more like, have a rheology that's similar to debris flows. How CO2 can create a rheology similar to debris flows, we don't know yet, so this is something we're still working on as well. So the open questions are that we have this huge similarity between gullies on Mars and gullies on Earth, and we can't explain present day activity with water, that's pretty much sure. We can produce perhaps water-like landforms with CO2 sublimation, but we don't know how yet. And also the sort of big elephant in the room, or the massive question, is really, does the present day activity really explain the whole formation of gullies? Maybe it's something water and CO2 acting alternately, depending on the climate conditions. So that's still an open door. But my talk's about liquid water. And so, okay, so we think the door is closing on liquid water for gullies. But I'm going to take you on another little journey where I think we found some actual I'm more convinced by this evidence than I am. I'm becoming more convinced for this than I am for the Martian gullies. So just as I mentioned really at the start of the talk, there's a lot of ice on Mars, and that ice is in the form of polar caps, but also in the form of glaciers. And so this is a map of glaciers on Mars. Bear in mind that they stopped mapping towards the poles because they got bored. So this is the furthest north and south the glaciers go on Mars. So there's a lot of glaciers on Mars, and they kind of look like this. These lobate tongues. They can also look like this. So inside craters, they can actually, you can see, fill the whole entirety of the crater, or fill part of the crater here. And bear in mind, or fill the crater here in this way. And so these glaciers on Mars are called concentric crater fill or lobate debris aprons, but I'm just going to use the word glacier because it's easier for people to understand. The thing you should notice is we don't see ice here at the surface. What we think is these are debris-covered glaciers, so the ice is protected from sublimation by a lag of debris, of regolith. And these images we'll see as well, there are gullies. I'll talk about that in a second. But what we noticed, because when we were studying gullies, is that the gullies are the same size no matter the age of their host crater, and no matter whether they have glacial deposits or not. Now we know glaciers on Mars were deposited, are much older. We can look at the superposed impact craters. They go to maybe 100 to 500 million years in age, so they're a lot older than gullies. But what we notice is that no matter what the landforms we find inside the craters or the age of the crater, the gullies are always the same size. This was kind of unexpected because we were thinking that, you know, the longer the crater had been exposed to gullying processes, the bigger the gullies would be. But a clue came from this observation is that we sometimes find these alcoves that look like they should have a gully inside but don't. And we came up with the hypothesis that maybe the glaciers are raising them. So to test this, we looked at lots and lots of sites throughout Mars, and the interesting observation that we came up with, very systematic, was that wherever we have glaciers inside craters, the bedrock on the glaciered, on the side that has the side of the crater that has the glacier, is different from the side of the crater that doesn't. And so to demonstrate this, what I'm talking about, here we have 3 craters. This is a fresh crater near the equator. This is a fresh crater with gullies inside it. And this is a crater with a glacier, and this is a crater with a glacier. So what do we get in? So in these 2 examples, these are craters without any glaciers. So what do we see on the crater walls? Well, we have these spurs of bedrock. And if we look at the other wall, we still have these spurs of bedrock in the fresh crater, and in the gully crater we have even more exaggerated spurs of bedrock. But if we look at the glaciated crater, those spurs of bedrock have disappeared and been replaced by this mushed up rock. And so the same here on the one without any gullies. So our observation was that wherever we're finding these glaciers, we found this this mushed up bedrock, this bedrock that had been, the spurs had been removed. So we thought, well, this looks like there's been erosion. So we actually went out and took high digital elevation models of these craters and sought to measure that erosion. So we compared craters that had glaciers and craters that did not have glaciers to make sure that we weren't going crazy. And what we did is we measured the slopes, the slope of this part of the crater here by looking at the profile. So this is a profile of the crater wall, and so we were just looking at this part here where the bedrock is exposed. And so we did 2 calculations. We compared that bedrock slope to what that slope might be expected to be if the crater were fresh. And we compared the 2 conjugate slopes within the crater itself to see how much more quickly the glaciated slope had eroded compared to the non-glaciated slope. And these are the results here, where we've converted them into erosion rates by 1 on this side using the age of the impact crater, and on this side by assuming a glacial era. So essentially what you can see is that the black triangles are the glaciated craters, and they actually have a slightly elevated erosion rate compared to the non-glaciated ones. There's just a general shift in that direction. But it's not a very realistic assumption to assume that the glacial erosion occurred over the whole age of the impact crater. It's much more realistic to assume that the glaciation occurred at a certain period, and we just took a period of 500,000 years used by other researchers from the literature. And if we do that, we end up with an erosion rate, a retreat rate of that crater wall of around 100 meters per million years. And what I've done here is I plotted on glacial erosion rates from New Zealand and Iceland, just give you to give you a comparison, and it's very similar to what we might find on Earth. Now, why is that surprising? Well, it's surprising because 100 meters per million year of retreat is equivalent to a wet-based glacial system on Earth, where there's water underneath the glacier, liquid water. Not equivalent to what we might expect, and has been measured for other glaciers on Mars, of cold-based glaciers that deform without liquid water viscously and erode their base much more slowly. And so this was really intriguing. So we have possibly liquid, not huge amounts, but a little liquid water forming under these glaciers, causing this enhanced erosion. And this is backed up by a couple of other observations. You actually, at the base of these systems where you see this bedrock, you often get these arcuate ridges here at the base of the crater wall, which resemble moraines on Earth. And moraines on Earth require a little bit of liquid water in order to allow the thrusting to occur, to bring the debris to the surface from the bed. And we also have this material that we often find below the mushed up bedrock, which is this pasted on material, which we could be interpreted as a basal ice-rich till, which would be consistent with basal sliding. Just as this is something we're working on right now, is to do a map to better show where this is actually occurring, but basically this is just a first shot to show you that this happens in all over the place on Mars. So we're not talking about one or two places where we had this basal erosion, but actually quite a lot of places. And so what this means is that we've had some kind of period at some point, we think around maybe 5 million years or 5 to 10 million years before present, where we had this period of glacial erosion. And whatever was there before, whether there were gullies there before or not, they were wiped out by this glacial erosion. And so this is why we don't see any old gullies. Gullies are all the same size because they were all reset by this period of glacial erosion. And so this ties together with what we were finding for gullies. But in order for the glacial erosion to be sufficient to have erased the gullies, we need it to have been wet-based to enable the erosion. So I'm going to stop there and conclude. Essentially, glacial erosion is probably the new liquid water on Mars. Evidence for recent liquid water on Mars, and we've shown that there's sufficient magnitude to actually erase gullies. We don't have signs of huge amounts of abundant surface water as a result of this. The moraines are intact, for example. So this implies small amounts of liquid water, but it's still liquid water. And the question is, well, if we have water that's involved in forming this erosion, and the moraines, why not in gullies too? All right. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Susan.